Hello, how are you, linguists? Welcome to another episode. It's actually episode 35 today of the Linguists Radio. I am just showing up here and I'm waiting for our special guest to join us in any moment. We just had some technical difficulties, so I hope that you are still gonna wait for her because it's someone very 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 special. I am greatly honored. So I'm just gonna go ahead. This is one of these things that happen when we go live, and I try to make these videos live so we can interact with all of you. So in the meantime, I would like to have a chat with you. This is my episode 35. Have you been enjoying the show lately so far? Have you liked the guests that we have had? This is kind of one of the guests that is going to close this amazing year, full of growth for many of us, full of challenges, obviously, for most of us. But yeah, this is. Let us know where you're watching from. I know that there are some people already watching us, and I really appreciate you joining us tonight. I'm going to repeat for those of you that are just joining in. I have a very special guest today with us, but we just had some technical difficulties. We were doing all the pre-interview stuff and something is happening with the internet, so with the connection. So I ask for your patience. Hey, there's my very best friend. Hi, Hyber. And there's my dear Cecilia. How are you doing, guys? Hello, JP Valdez. Nice to see you. Tell us, where are you watching us from? So yes, we were just having some pre-interview discussions and something happened with the internet. This kind of things happen when we go live. So I apologize for that. Mr. Baye, so glad to see you. I know that thanks to you, many people have found out about the interview that we're going to have tonight. This interview has had more engagements and more reach than any other interviewee guests that I've had in the show so far. I am so happy that all of you are interested in listening to this magnificent person, Holly Mikkelson. She's going to be with us in just a few seconds. We have already tried everything that we need to try, so we're ready to go. I'm just waiting for her, and it's just a matter of internet connection. So we're just gonna wait. In the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and do her introduction, her bio, because she knows about her bio. But I'm gonna tell you who I have today for the show. It's Miss Holly Mikkelson, as I mentioned. She is Professor Emerita at the Graduate School of Translation, Interpretation, and Language Education, Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. She's an ATA certified translator, Spanish-English, English-Spanish, and a state and federally certified court interpreter who has taught translation and interpreting for 4 decades. In addition to co-authoring Fundamentals of Court Interpretation, Theory, Policy, and Practice, she is the author of Introduction to Court Interpreting, as well as the ACIBO Interpreter Training Manuals and numerous articles on translation and interpretation. There she is. Professor Mikkelson has consulted with many government and private entities on interpreter testing and training, and has presented lectures and workshops to interpreters and related professionals throughout the world. In 2011, the American Translators Association awarded her the prestigious Alexander Gould Medal for Outstanding Service to the translation and interpreting professions. And there she is. She finally was able to join us. Is everything okay, Ms. Mikkelson?
Yeah, I'm on my laptop now.
Uh-huh.
I hope it doesn't. I'm on my laptop now. I hope it doesn't conk out again. I don't know what happened.
Yeah. I don't know either. I all of a sudden we were having this really good conversation, and all of a
Oh
sudden it
no,
stopped working. It was good,
I
but
know.
welcome.
Thank you.
We have a lot of people watching us already. Danny Dodero, some of my really good friends, colleagues, Mr. Tony Valle is here, Caterina Borghi, Susana Valdez, Sandra Valencia, Jairo Jimenez, a bunch of people, Cecilia Lopez, a lot of them watching us from all over the states. And let us know, what state are you watching us from? New York, Texas, Salt Lake City. So yes, thank you so much for watching us. They are all here for you, Miss Mikkelson.
Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. Some familiar names out there.
Yeah, so the way I found out about you was through someone that I actually had interviewed here a few months ago, Gabriela Sivak, and we were talking about mentors. And obviously she mentioned you, and we went like, "Well, would you please put us in contact with her? We would really like to have her in the show because, well, you are a legend, and Gabriela is an amazing interpreter and colleague, and is always willing to help." And she was talking about how good of an impact you and mentors like you caused in her professional career. So I kind of wanted to have like a little brief chat with you about that. Like, how do you think we need more mentors in our profession?
Absolutely. I used to tell students all the time, go to court and find an interpreter working and ask if you can shadow them. And unfortunately, in many cases, interpreters didn't want to be shadowed. They felt like somebody was spying on them. If they made a mistake, somebody would judge them, or they didn't want to help any potential competitors. That's certainly not always the case. I think there are more interpreters willing to help than there are not willing to help, but that does seem to be a problem. The ATA, the American Translators Association, has a mentoring program. I haven't heard much about it lately. I don't know how active it is, but that's the kind of thing that is really helpful for newcomers.
Yeah. I do believe that we do need more mentors, as you're saying. And I was actually just taking one of the webinars from ATA yesterday, and I was listening to one of Catherine Allen's webinars, and she was mentioning something along those lines. So I think it is important to encourage everyone to go ahead and try to at least, I don't know. I feel like a mentor is a great responsibility as well, because someone is looking at you, right? So yeah, but I think that we should all. I remember when I was interpreting in court a couple of times, colleagues that were just starting in immigration court came, and I've always felt really insecure. I think it's just a clutch that all interpreters have, and maybe some translators as well. But like, I felt super insecure. But hey, if it's to help, and at least if they can learn from my mistakes, then they're going to probably do a better job. But today we're going to be talking about some very interesting topics and kind of poignant as well. What do you think?
Yes. What I think we're going to be talking about mostly is interpreting in conflict situations or in the aftermath of conflict situations, war crimes, tribunals, and truth commissions, situations when people have been traumatized and the interpreter has to deal with not only the content of the message, but their own emotional reaction to it. And of course, you mentioned immigration, asylum hearings is another major traumatizing experience for interpreters. Yeah.
It is indeed. And tonight we're going to be talking about this book that you commented, and I started reading it for this interview, and I thought it was just amazing, all the information for us that are working towards or already working in court interpreting. It is by Ellen Elias-Bursac, Elias-Bursac. The name of the book is Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal. And it talks about the fragmentation, I guess, of the former Yugoslavia and how Bosnia, Herzegovina, and what's the other one?
Serbia, Croatia,
Serbia,
Montenegro.
Croatia.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But mainly it was Serbia, Croatia, I believe, that she was interpreting for. But she tells the story of all the intricacies that were happening with the interpreters and translator teams, and how did this make the success, it caused the success that at the end this tribunal had.
Mhm.
So I want to start with some of the things that she mentions on the website, or where the book is, and it says, how can defendants be tried if they cannot understand the charges being raised against them? Can a witness testify if the judges and attorneys cannot understand what the witness is saying? Can a judge decide whether to convict or acquit if she or he cannot read the documentary evidence? The very viability of international criminal prosecution and adjudication hinges on the massive amounts of translation and interpreting that are required to run these lengthy, complex trials, and the procedures for handling the demands facing language services. So you are the person to talk about this.
Well, I've
Let's
never
talk about this.
interpreted in an international tribunal, but I think one advantage interpreters have in those settings is that the judges are equally dependent on listening to the interpretation. In the courts in the US, we know that judges and juries and attorneys depend on the interpretation of witness testimony, but it's interpreted into English, and there's no question that the judge knows English. But in the international tribunals, English and French are the official languages of most of them. And the judges who don't speak English are listening to attorneys speaking French addressing the court, for example. So they need the interpretation all the time. There usually are panels of judges, and they don't all share a language necessarily. So the judges are totally dependent on interpreting, much more than they are in this country with all English proceedings.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that makes a difference because the judges insist on quality and they insist on proper working conditions. Often when we're interpreting for a defendant who has limited English, they're in a very powerless position. And the judge is more concerned about keeping the trial going, making sure they don't waste time, getting it over with as quickly as they can justifiably do. But they're not dependent on the interpreting, except when a witness is testifying in another language. And I think that makes a huge difference for the interpreters.
Yep. And just along those lines that you're just mentioning, something that we as immigration interpreters have noticed very often is when the it's not the defendant, it's the I'm so sorry.
Respondent?
The respondent, yes, thank you. When the respondent brings not only one, but a bunch of attorneys with them, like a buffet, right? What we call them in Spanish, a whole firm of attorneys with them. We know that they have this strategy. So we know that that's going to be a tough case because we are really watched in those scenarios. So the same thing is mentioned by Ms. Elias-Bursac here, and it says, language-based strategies are natural to the defense in international war crime trials because, unlike the attorneys for the prosecution, at least one of the counsel in every defense team speaks the language of the accused, and it is in charge of monitoring the interpreted testimony and translated evidence for anything that might be working to the disadvantage of the accused. And in this way, they can explain us what could happen in that case, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, interpreters, I'm sure, are used to being scapegoats. In our cases in the US, They always claim that there was a problem with the interpretation if the witness doesn't testify the way they expected or the way they would like them to testify. It's easy to say, Your Honor, there was a problem with the interpretation. So that's universal. I think lawyers will seize on anything they possibly can to make sure that they get ahead, to give every advantage to their own case. But there were legitimate language issues in those trials with Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian. The problem with those languages is that they are, until very recently, were considered one language. It was Serbo-Croatian. And there are distinctions in the usage in Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia, just as there are distinctions in Australian English and British English and US English. So there are a lot of terms that might not be familiar to a particular interpreter. If I had to go into an English court in London, say, I wouldn't understand a lot of what they were saying, even though English is my native language, because the vocabulary and the pronunciation differ so much. And that was what they were facing, plus the fact that a witness testifying who was Bosnian did not want a Serbian interpreter interpreting for them. If they heard the accent or certain vocabulary items that identified that as the Serbian variant of the language, then they wouldn't trust the interpreter. So that became an issue too. Sometimes it was wielded as a weapon, sometimes for the defense, that they wanted interpreters who spoke the variety of Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian that their particular defendant required.
I think that was a very interesting part of the book. And so you mentioned at the beginning how the judges depended in that case, in that tribunal, on the interpreters and the translators, and how everything was successful at the end, according to the book, because of the importance that judges gave to us as a team. Well, not I'm just saying as interpreters and translators. What do you think we need to get to that point? Because every case is important. So, well, this is just a personal opinion, but how do we get, this is like the mission of the Linguist Radio, is to make the profession more relevant. And I know that there are a lot of steps that we still need to follow to get there. But how do we become a little more relevant in your eyes as maybe court interpreters, which is when the law is around, maybe it can be a little more taken seriously?
Well, there are many, many judges who take it seriously and who treat their interpreters well and who safeguard the working conditions. But there are many judges who regard us as a nuisance. And we take extra time. We ask for repetitions. Sometimes the interpretation itself kind of disturbs people if they're hearing it in the background and they can't concentrate. And there are sometimes challenges to the interpretation, so they have to take time to litigate that. And I don't blame them, I guess, for not wanting this extra complication in a trial, but we just have to keep on telling them and demonstrating with cases where there has been a miscarriage of justice and a conviction has been overturned on appeal due to interpretation issues. The more that happens, the more importance they'll attribute to getting qualified interpreters and making sure that they have proper working conditions.
Yes. So I've had you are a court interpreter. You have had over 40 years of experience, I believe. And I'm a very new immigration interpreter. But I guess that at some point we kind of know the similarities very soon between Mrs. Elias-Bursac, you, all of your years of experience, and me and many others that are watching us right now. And I wanted to read another paragraph of the book regarding that. And just so people can understand the impact of all of these wars. It says the wars investigated by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia caused the dissolution of Yugoslavia. They lasted for 8 years, from the first shots fired in Slovenia on 27 June 1991 to the cessation of hostilities in Kosovo on 3 June 1999. During this time, 140,000 people were killed and 4 million were displaced in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. And the fighting was still fierce when the International Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established by the United Nations Security Council resolution in 25th May 1993, and this lasted for many more years after that. We have kind of a similar situation in this part of the world. How do we, as court interpreters, immigration or just court interpreters in general, what can we take from this book and apply it to our day-to-day work to become better interpreters, would you say?
Well, the importance of teamwork, I guess. The interpreters and the translators were in close touch with each other. They coordinated things. The translators were always developing glossaries that the interpreters used, or they would consult on the best way to translate a given term. As the usage varied slightly, the interpreters would say, hey, translators, we discovered that this term has some other nuance that you haven't been aware of yet. And so I think that collaboration is really helpful. When we interpret in court, we don't have a whole team of people researching terms for us and giving us glossaries. If you're lucky enough to have team interpreting, you have your co-interpreter who's available to look things up or remind you of words you've forgotten or something, but that's still on the fly. It's not something that's being done over a period of months and years where you have that much more support.
Right. You have gotten to know the culture that you might be interpreting for a little better, like in this case. Yeah, you don't have that in here. That's true. So let's talk about what you're doing, what you've been doing a little more recently. You recently retired, right?
Yes.
How is that going?
Too well, I think. I don't miss working at all. Of course, I miss students. Teaching is very rewarding, but it's also a lot of hard work. I don't miss having to prepare for classes and having to give grades. I've always hated grading. I think most teachers do. And I miss interpreting. I didn't plan on stopping. As soon as I did, when the pandemic hit, we couldn't have in-person hearings. And I just don't like remote interpreting. I know that it's something you have to adapt to, and it's going to be more and more present in the judicial system even after the pandemic for reasons of convenience. But I just don't like it. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to say, sorry, I'm out of here. I don't have to adapt to it.
Right.
But I do miss interpreting a lot. I'm still translating a little. I wish I had more translation work, but everything seems to have ground to a halt.
Seems like it, yes. But many of us are very hopeful, and other little lights are starting to shine here and there about maybe interpreters have obviously been hit the hardest. But maybe learning new skills and doing translations, as you were mentioning. So you are translating, and you told me that recently you had translated something related to the Spanish Civil War. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
It's called Lenguas entre dos fuegos, Languages in the Crossfire. It was written by Professor Jesus Begorri Jalón, who is a Spaniard. He's a former UN interpreter who then got a PhD in the history of interpreting. So he's a historian, and he's written several books about the history of interpreting. And I translated with a colleague one of his previous books about the history of conference interpreting, and that covered the Nuremberg trials, among other things. So I was already acquainted with him, and I volunteered to translate this book because I like his work and I'm interested in history myself. We turned it into a student project. The students at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies translated one chapter among the 6 or 8 of them. I forget how many there were, but they translated one chapter, and I translated the rest, and of course revised their translation. So it was a long process, and anybody who has dealt with publishers knows how frustrating it is when you submit a manuscript and they come back and they say, well, you need to tweak this and you need to do that, and the formatting isn't right. Bibliographic references are a real headache. And there are so many style manuals for English. You know, if you're writing for Spanish, you have the Real Academia. If you're writing for French or German, you have national standard setting entities, or I should say international. But English is just anything goes. So we decided that we were going to go by the Chicago Style Manual for little niggling details like how you cite bibliographic references and whether you capitalize this, that, or the other thing, whether something goes in italics or boldface or whatever. So we very scrupulously followed all of those rules. And then the publisher said, oh, well, we have this editorial team and we're including this book in a new series. And the series has its own editors, and here are their style guidelines. And everything was completely different from what we had done with the Chicago Manual, including dates. Instead of saying, for example, October 23rd, 1947, they would say 23 October 1947. And whether there is a comma in the middle or not, all these little details had to be checked, and was very time consuming and not directly related to the translation at all. Right. But they did read it as consumers. They didn't necessarily know Spanish, so they were only looking at the English. And they did notice a lot of things that were inconsistent or something didn't quite sound right in English. So it was good for me to have that extra editing happening.
The post-editing part,
yeah. Yeah. I often translate for clients and just send them the translation, and nobody ever looks at it after that. And I always wonder how many mistakes did I make that weren't caught because nobody revised it.
I'm sure it's. I mean, it's great quality, but yeah, post editing is becoming a thing now. I was just taking a course this morning about it, and very interesting the things that are coming up with machine translation and all that.
Yeah.
So Holly, I'm so sorry. J.P. Valdez has a question for you. It says she's Mexican, or he, I guess, is an senior interpreter in immigration court. He's Mexican and often struggle with Spanish from other countries, specifically. The biggest struggles are Cuban and Venezuelan. Any tips for looking up specialist vocabulary or on the spot? I invested in an iPad to take my notes and look up terms, but even so, there are struggles. Like on Monday when I had a Venezuelan who was using very specific financial and economic terms.
Well, I consider myself very lucky in many ways, and one of them is that I interpret on the central coast of California, where the vast majority of the Spanish speakers are Mexican. So I am very familiar with Mexican usage. I try to read and expose myself to audio materials from every Spanish-speaking country in the world. But if I had to interpret on a daily basis for a great variety of nationalities, the way you would have to in a big city like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, I would have much more of a struggle understanding regional variations. And Mexican Spanish, to me, is very clear and pronounced clearly, and I should say Peruvian Spanish is too. But the Cubans, I really have trouble understanding Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Venezuelans.
It's the Caribbean.
The Caribbean, yeah. I think the way of speaking in the Caribbean is much more difficult for me because I'm just not used to it.
Yeah. If I may, JP is a she. I apologize. I think that the best way for me was to look up the newspapers from the country. So if you just look up like the most important newspaper from Venezuela, for instance, or Colombia, or I don't know, Salvador, whatever country you're interpreting for, I would say that that's probably the best way because they usually give you a lot of vocabulary and you can keep up with the stories. That's the way I used to train myself for interpreting Venezuelans who not only have the accent but also are the register is extremely high. So it's very specialized.
It depends on who they are. Yeah, if it's economic and financial terms, that is probably standard Spanish, actually. I mean, there's a difference between technical language and regional usage in colloquialisms.
Yeah.
And I read a lot of novels from all over the Spanish-speaking world. So the dialogues in those novels teach me a lot about the usage there, but I don't hear them.
Right.
I think it would be really good for interpreters who have to interpret for a lot of different nationalities to get access to movies and news broadcasts and talk shows from those countries, which you can do now with the internet, so that you can hear people actually speaking in an everyday situation rather than someone who's talking about finance. I think, have we lost it again?
No, we're here.
I thought it froze. I think that a banker in Spain and a banker in Argentina and a banker in Colombia would be able to understand each other perfectly well. They might have minor differences in vocabulary, but it's the everyday person in the street who speaks very differently, and that is what takes a lot of adjustment.
Yeah, that is true. One thing that I have, this is a personal question. Well, not a personal question. It's a question from me. Do you think it's okay to ask the judge just a very simple and plain, like, what is this case going to be about? Like, are we going to be, am I going to be interpreting an oil engineer or I don't know, a farmer?
Yeah,
just to have kind of the vocabulary on hand.
That's absolutely essential. And that is recommended in anything that's written about interpreting. The standard procedures for interpreters, and most courts have rules about interpreted proceedings. They have to give the interpreter access to case material so that they know what's coming. Whenever I interpreted in a deposition, which is what I was doing the last 10 years or so before I retired, I would walk in and say, what can you tell me about this case? Is it a car accident? Is it an injured worker? Is it medical malpractice? I would try to get that information even before I walked in. I'd try to get it from the person who called me, but they usually say, well, I don't know. So I get it from the lawyers when I walk in and say, what are we dealing with here? So that I can at least start mentally preparing myself. Do I need to know car parts, or do I need to know insurance terminology, or what is this going to be? but it is an essential part of being prepared for a case, and judges, by all means, should let you have access to that information.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know really too much about civil court. I know that when I have shadowed to with interpreters for depositions, I have done the exact same thing, and they told me, I don't know, and I was like, well, how can I bring, what glossary am I gonna bring? But I know for a fact, for at least in my case and in my colleague's case here in Houston, it was like you just go in and jump, and you have no idea what's gonna happen. And it's unfair. It's a little unfair.
It is unfair. But even when you do know in advance what the problem is, you're going to run into some things that are unexpected. Somebody will be talking about an object that you had no idea was going to come up in the testimony. You don't know what that thing is called, or you don't recognize it, or you can't remember the appropriate translation. That happens all the time. And you just have to be honest with the court and say, the interpreter is not familiar with that term, or may the interpreter inquire, or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. So Mr. Tony Valle is asking, this is one resource to look up. I'm so sorry. This is not the question. This is the question. Given the impact of COVID on the courts, would you advise interpreters to consider interpreting in other fields like medical?
Well, I think that it affects all aspects of interpreting. A lot of people are not going to the doctor for routine things because they're sheltering in place, or they don't want to be exposed in a waiting room or whatever. But I would be very nervous about interpreting for a long period of time in a small room with a doctor and a patient, or with an attorney or a client, or whatever the case. So I think that if you're going to pursue a career as an interpreter, you have to be able to do remote interpreting at this point. If I were just starting in the field, I would do that. But it doesn't matter what field you are in. You're going to have to do a lot of remote interpreting, at least for the duration of this pandemic. But as I say, I think a lot of things have changed, and they're going to be doing a lot more video conference communication in general, even after this is over.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I agree with you on that. Miss Eliane says, what do you do when you feel mental fatigue is hitting you after you have interpreted for a few hours nonstop?
Well, a few hours is a very long time. And again, it depends on the nature of the interpreted interaction. Are there long pauses between the statements that you have to interpret? Is it a short question and answer kind of thing, or is it long speeches, or what kind of material are you dealing with? How stressful is the content, whether it's highly technical or whether it's emotional? A lot of that goes into how quickly you get tired. But I think that what you need to do is ask for a break. Hopefully they'll give you a long enough break that you can get some fresh air and drink some water and clear your head. And the ideal situation is having a team interpreting situation so that you can spell each other. But I think that's still pretty rare. I think Spanish interpreters in the federal courts are used to doing that, and in many state courts, they're used to doing that. But if you interpret in a rare language, they're not going to find a team for you, a colleague who can interpret in that language in many cases.
I think that the ones that suffer the most from us all are the immigration interpreters, because they just we don't really have too much with like that back there.
I know the working conditions of immigration interpreters are less advanced, say, than they are in other court systems. But what I heard when I first started training immigration interpreters, they told me they had to be clerk/interpreters, and they were recording the minutes of the case at hand while they were interpreting for somebody. And that's just insane.
Yes. Yeah.
So I hope they've ended that practice.
Yes. No, well, at least here I've not knowledge of that happening, but yeah, that would be, I would probably not accept the job if that
No.
was the case.
Yeah, well, they weren't actually interpreting everything. That's the problem. They
Right.
would be doing their clerk business, and then they would provide a brief summary for the non-English speaker. I mean, it just wasn't
That wasn't
workable.
interpreting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about your point of view on the importance then, especially I guess for everything, every kind of court interpreting, but especially in immigration now that we're talking about it. How important is our role in crisis and war times? And would you recommend focusing on a specific region, maybe South America, Central America, to get to know its history? Or, I mean, I'm just saying that because you are
There have been hurricanes that have caused a lot of damage. And there's the pandemic, of course, all over the world. But that hurricane caused enough of a crisis that people who might not have wanted to leave earlier now have to leave. If they haven't got any farm left, for example, or wherever they were working just blew away, they find themselves forced to have go somewhere else to look for a way to make a living, and that somewhere else could be the United States. So if you know that happened, you know you're going to have to face a lot of Central Americans, more so than people from the southern cone of South America, for example. And yeah, you would want to make sure you read the newspaper stories about the storm's devastation, or if there's been an earthquake or something like that, you want to read up on it. But I think a lot of it is more long-term. If you're interpreting in immigration court, you see patterns of nationalities. There have been more Venezuelans, for example, seeking asylum than in the past because Venezuela was such a prosperous country. So you know that you have to get used to Venezuelan usage if that's going to be happening in the court where you work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to talk about something that one of my dear colleagues and friends mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago when I told her that I was going to interview you, and she is reading one of your books. In this book, you mentioned that how you talk about how interpreters are expected to be a fly on the wall, right? But you actually have a little bit of a discrepancy with that. Would you tell us about it?
Yeah, when I first started going to workshops and learning about court interpreting, I had gone to school in Monterey and learned interpreting, but the emphasis was on conference interpreting in international environments. I never did that, but that's what the training was for. And I started working in court because that's what was available in California. And there was no training specifically for court interpreters. And I'm talking about mid-70s here, so this was a long time ago. But the California Court Interpreters Association was founded right about that time. And they started having conferences with workshops, and they started publishing information about ethics and that kind of thing. And so I started learning more about what we were supposed to do. And the party line was always be unobtrusive. If you're doing your job well, they won't even know that you're there. Be invisible. And I subscribed to that, and I thought that was my job. And most of the time, it's true. You should not be obtrusive. You shouldn't be interfering in the process. They shouldn't be aware at all times that you're there. But the fact is, you are a person, a body who is present in the room. And people aren't going to ignore you. They're going to look at your facial expressions and your body language. They're going to hear your tone of voice and that kind of thing. And they'll draw inferences from that. And if there is some kind of misunderstanding, then I think it is appropriate to intervene. And even the oldest codes of ethics said that the interpreter should inform the court if there's a term they don't know, and that kind of thing. But it was always aimed at keeping it to a minimum. But when I started reading more about what healthcare interpreters do and what the sign language interpreters do in their ordinary work, I realized that that's not the only model, and that there actually was a book written called The Myth of the Invisible Interpreter. You're not invisible. Your presence changes the interaction, and you need to acknowledge that. But it in a way, it complicates our work. It would be much easier if you just kept your mouth shut and interpreted the words and didn't think about it. Because when you do intervene, you have to make that decision. Am I changing things? Am I being too intrusive? And am I losing my impartiality by intervening in some way if there is a misunderstanding? So it's a judgment call, and those are always hard. It's much easier to just say, well, I'm just going to interpret the words. And so it complicates your life if you're constantly making these decisions about whether or not to intervene if there's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, but that is basically the core of being an interpreter, right? Because yes, they tell us to be invisible, a fly on the wall, but we are also supposed to interpret the ideas and the emotions and the expressions. And as you're saying, I believe we have to put a little bit of ourselves on that interpretation. So we cannot be just completely robotic in that sense. We have to be neutral and impartial, but not robotic. And I think that's what I'm getting from what you're saying. We have one more question from Mr. Valle. He says, beyond attending classes, how would you advise interpreters to work on a skill development on a daily, regular basis?
Well, practice interpreting things like talk shows and interviews where people are speaking extemporaneously, because if you try to do someone reading a speech that's written on paper, they're going to go too fast and it's going to be too dense. And that goes for news broadcasts too. They're trying to cram as much information as possible into this limited amount of time. You want to interpret spontaneous speech. And the really important thing about doing that practice is recording yourself and listening to yourself afterwards, because you don't necessarily know if you've missed something or if you misunderstood something. You have to be critical of yourself, and the only way to do that is to record yourself and then listen to it and then make changes. Even though it's artificial and in real life you don't get a repeat, when you're practicing, it's really good to repeat the same thing over and over again and continue to refine it. So that kind of practice, I think, is really helpful. Sight translation is always good, too. If you have some sort of written material, and it doesn't have to be related to the work you do, it can be something completely different. Anything you can get on the internet, practice sight translating it, record yourself, listen to it, and see if that would be intelligible to somebody listening to it without the source text.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because most instructors tell us to practice with TED Talks, with speeches and things like that. And I believe that is great for conference interpreting. But you're right. When we want to focus on court interpreting and the craziness that often happens in there, the best thing to do would be spontaneous speeches.
Well, if you're talking about witness testimony, it is.
Right.
But in court, there's an awful lot of legal language that is very dense because they have memorized standard admonitions, for example, or procedural matters, and they have a heavy court docket that they want to get through, so they rattle these things off at an incredible speed. But the way to prepare for that is to get court material. Again, you can get it from the internet because they do broadcast court proceedings, and practice interpreting that legal jargon because that's very repetitive. You hear the same phrases over and over again. But when I mention interpreting extemporaneous speech, that's more just because it's easier to interpret and it gives you more of a chance to analyze what you're doing. But with court proceedings and all of the English that goes on there, I think you're better off with memorization, really. Memorizing those key phrases and making sure that they're at the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, those usually are. I mean, if you really work on them after hours or before, you get there, it becomes easier than interpreting testimony. So Gabriel J says, "Good evening. I know time is short, but I would like to hear from some funny anecdote that comes to your mind." Does anything come to your mind?
Well, something like in a deposition that was about a work injury, they asked if the deponent was married. I can't remember exactly how it came up, but he was reluctant to answer the question. And so his attorney had a client conference with him and said, "What's going on here?" And the guy said, "Well, I am married in Mexico, but I'm married here too." And the attorney said, "Oh, okay, well, we're going to make sure that doesn't get on the record, but you have to answer the question about whether you're married." So there are things like that you find out about in attorney-client conferences or consultations that are rather delicate issues sometimes.
That's very funny. Mrs. Mikkelson, it has been a pleasure. We have had quite a few viewers. We are so happy that you were able to join us. It's an honor. Well, just in case you don't know, but I'm sure you know, if you're here, you know that Mrs. Mikkelson is the one that produced the Acebo books for preparing you. If you want to take any exam, if you want to become a court interpreter, you should purchase one of the books. But Marcela Reina says, "I still use her books in my classes." Patricia Marina Howard says, "I'm so humble. She's an icon." So many people are watching you and admire you and following you. Do you have any final words before we close this episode?
Well, given all of that, it's kind of hard to respond to that. I'm very grateful to everyone who has followed my work, and people come up to me all the time and thank me, and I never get tired of it. I'm just very honored that I have been able to contribute that to the profession. I think that people tend to overestimate my skills because I've written those books. That doesn't make me a better interpreter. It just means I know how to make books. I do consider myself a good interpreter, but I am constantly worried that I'm making mistakes in Spanish because it's not my native language. I envy people who are native bilinguals, or people who have lived many years in another country and live and breathe the language, because that's something I never did. And I'm very insecure about that kind of thing. But I'm really flattered when people say all these nice things about me. So
would you, if you had a magic wand and you have to choose a country to go live besides the United States, which country would that be?
Oh, that's not fair.
You can choose more than one. It's fine.
Yeah, but I risk making enemies of everybody. No, I really can't say that.
Okay.
I have visited many countries and I love the places I've been. I'd like to see other countries that I've never seen. But I don't think I could say that any one country is more attractive than another.
Right. Yeah. I get it. Traveling, it's a thing. I also am a fan of many countries. Everyone wants to see you again. Maybe next year we'll have you again. I would love to have you again to see. And one last question that I have: do you? And I didn't send you this in the pre-interview. This is just a question that just came to my mind. Do you plan to make any memoirs of your interpreting or of your job at any time?
No.
No?
No, I would find that really difficult.
Yeah.
I like translating other people's work, and I can talk all day long about court interpreting, but memoirs, it never occurred to me to do such a thing.
Okay.
I don't see it happening.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you so much, Mrs. Mikkelson, and thank you to everyone who has watched. I really appreciate you guys following and your support to Linguist Radio. Mrs. Mikkelson, whenever you want to come over and share with us any news that you may have, you're welcome to. But if not, I will try to get you again next year, probably at the end of the year around this time, to see how you're doing, because you have a lot of fans following you.
Thank you. I do want to say, just in parting, that I admire you for doing this project, the Linguists Radio, and it always amazes me how much solidarity there is in our profession, that all of these people continue to tune in and watch things or read things and contribute to the profession. So I think it's really admirable.
Yes, thank you. I know there are a lot of translation and interpretation podcasts out there that are really, really, really good. And yeah, I agree. Everyone in this, if we want to push this to a better future, we really, all of us have to push it together. So thank you for those words, and it has been an honor to have you here. And we'll see you, linguists, in the next episode. Thank you for being there. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.